Dear students, today I am going to explain something in chemistry. It is Bode-Bury scheme related to calculation of maximum number of electrons in the different orbits of an atom. Bohr and Bury, they were two scientists, chemists, suggested that maximum number of electrons in an orbit is equals to 2n square, where n equals to orbit number, which is also known as shell. On the basis of this rule, maximum number of electrons in first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh orbit are 2, 8, 18, 32, 50, 72, 98 respectively. How it will be? As in the case of first cell or first orbit, 2 into 1 square will be 2. Second orbit, 2 into 2 square will be 8. In the third orbit, 2 into 3 square will be 18. In the fourth orbit, 2 into 4 square will be 32. In this way, they will calculate it. In addition, they also suggested in what preferential order the electrons will be arranged in various orbits. This order is given below. First, first two electrons will be accommodated in the first orbit K. Example is helium He2, that is K cell. Second point, next electrons will thereafter be accommodated in the second orbit L. Thereafter 8 electrons go to the third orbit M. Example is sodium, whose atomic number is 11. It is 2 in the first shell, 8 in the second cell L, and 1 in the third cell M. And in potassium, whose atomic number is 19, first shell 2 and second cell L, 8 electrons, third cell M, 8 electrons, and fourth cell N, 1 electron. Now, third point is fourth orbit N begins to be filled once there becomes 8 electrons in the third orbit M cell. Example, zinc, whose atomic number is 30. So in the first orbit K, 2 electrons, second orbit L, 8 electrons, third orbit M, 18 electrons, and fourth orbit N, 2 electrons. So third orbit can accommodate maximum 18 electrons, but once there are 8 electrons in the third orbit, that is M cell, next electron goes to the fourth orbit N cell, as in the case of potassium atom shown above. As here we have seen 2881 of potassium. Fourth point is the outermost orbit contains 2 electrons and penultimate orbit contains more than 2 electrons only when the orbit preceding the penultimate orbit is completely filled. As here you see, calcium, whose atomic number is 20. Here first shell K, 2 electrons, second cell L, 8 electrons, third cell M, 8 electrons, and fourth cell N, 2 electrons. So here N cell, which contains 2 electrons, is the outermost orbit. it has 2 electrons. And according to the rule, it will contain 2 electrons, and penultimate orbit contains more than 2 electrons. So penultimate orbit is here M, which contains 8 electrons. This is penultimate orbit. Yeah, and it will contain more than 8 electrons. Its example is in iron, whose atomic number is 26. Here you find that in the outermost orbit 2 electrons are there, and before that, that is penultimate orbit. This is the outermost orbit which contains 2 electrons, and before this is M orbit, that is penultimate orbit, which contains more than 8 electrons. And it will contain more than 8 electrons only when orbit preceding penultimate orbit will have 8 electrons. That means it will be filled. So here L cell is filled. If L cell is not filled, then in M cell, which is penultimate orbit, cannot have more than 8 electrons. Okay, this you have to keep in mind. Here in the case of calcium also you find in the outermost orbit 2 electrons are there only when the penultimate orbit is having 8 electrons, and before this second cell, that is L cell, which is orbit preceding the penultimate orbit, is filled one. It is filled one. It is its maximum capacity second orbit has of 8 electrons. So it is filled one, and that's why in the third cell here 8 electrons are there, and it can be more. This is the condition. Penultimate orbit will have more than 8 electrons only when second orbit, which is orbit preceding penultimate orbit, is filled. That means second orbit capacity is of 8 electrons, it will have 8 electrons. So here iron, whose atomic number is 26, in the first orbit 2 electrons, second orbit 8 electrons, which is the filled cell, and third orbit, which is M cell, it has 14 electrons, which is more than 8, and fourth, that is the outermost orbit, has 2 electrons. So I think it will be clear to you which is outermost orbit, which is penultimate orbit, which is orbit preceding penultimate orbit, and what condition it follows. Thank you. If you like, please share and subscribe. In the next video, I will explain you about SPDF, distribution of electrons in the different orbits, different subcells. Thank you.